I still remember the morning we received the order to cut off the enemy's lifeline. It was not a loud order. No shouting, no dramatic speech, no big map room like people see in movies. Our company commander squatted beside a damp tree stump and spread a wrinkled map across it. The paper was soft from sweat and rain. His finger stopped on a thin trail running through the jungle like a vein. Rice, medicine, ammunition, he said quietly. They move through here at night. If we cut this route, the Pon Pot unit deeper in the forest will weaken by itself. That was the mission. Not to charge forward, not to take a hill, not to count bodies. We were there to watch, confirm, and support from a distance. For a sniper, that kind of mission was heavier than most people understand. Pulling the trigger was only one small part of the job. The harder part was knowing when not to pull it. There were 3 of us. Wah was my spotter. He was thin, dark from the sun and quiet in a way that made other men lower their voices around him. He could look at a broken blade of grass and tell whether someone had passed before dawn or after sunrise. In his pack, he carried binoculars wrapped in a piece of old cloth, a hammock tarp, and a small notebook where he sketched trails, tree lines, and estimated distances. He once told me that after the war he wanted to teach children in his village. I believed him. He had the patience of a teacher. Luke was the youngest, our radio man and ammunition carrier. He had a dented canteen that leaked if you laid it on the wrong side. He complained about it every day but never traded it away, because his father had given it to him before he left home. At night, when we were allowed a whisper, he talked about building his mother a brick house with a real roof. Not palm leaves that rattled and leaked in the rain. I carried my rifle, a small pair of binoculars, dried rice wrapped in cloth, and my range notebook. In that notebook were numbers that looked meaningless to anyone else. 180 meters to the termite mound. 240 to the fallen palm. 310 to the bend in the trail. In the jungle, distance could lie to your eyes. A good notebook could keep men alive. For 3 days, we moved less than animals. We crawled under thorns, lay in wet leaves, and covered our helmets with mud and cut branches. The smell of damp earth stayed in my nose until I could taste it. Mosquitoes crawled into my ears. Ants crossed my sleeves. At night, the forest made sounds that seemed close enough to touch. Insects grinding. Branches cracking. Something moving in the dark. On the 3rd afternoon, Wah touched my arm. Through the binoculars, I saw movement on the trail. Several figures came slowly between the trees. Some carried sacks. One had a rifle slung low across his chest. I placed my cheek against the stalk and breathed out. Then I saw 2 smaller shapes behind them, thin and barefoot, carrying bundles too heavy for their bodies. My finger froze beside the trigger. The mission was to cut off the source of life feeding the enemy. But in that moment, through the glass, I could not tell whose life I was looking at. Wah did not say anything at first. He only pressed his eye harder against the binoculars and held up 2 fingers. Then pointed toward the rear of the small column. That was his way of telling me to look again. Slower this time. I eased my breathing and shifted my sight a little to the left. The first man carried a rifle across his chest. Not an AK but an old weapon with a long wooden stock. His shirt was black, faded gray at the shoulders from sun and rain. Behind him were 2 men with sacks of rice tied across bamboo poles. Then came the 2 barefoot figures I had seen before. They were not soldiers. They were boys, maybe 13 or 14, thin as saplings, their shoulders bent under bundles wrapped in palm leaves. Farther back, half hidden by brush, I saw the thing that changed everything. 3 armed men walking wide on both sides of the trail. They were not traveling like farmers. They were covering the column. Wah lowered the binoculars just enough to whisper, "Supply escort." I nodded, but my fingers stayed still. That was the burden of our job. From far away, every decision looked clean on paper. Enemy supply line, enemy escort, enemy route. But through a rifle scope, the world was never clean. It came with faces, sweat, shaking hands, and children carrying loads they should never have touched. Luke lay behind us with the radio pressed close to his ear. His canteen rested near his elbow, dented side up, catching a thin line of sunlight. He whispered that the scouting team below us was already moving toward the lower bend of the trail. If the escort reached that bend first, our men could be spotted. I opened my range notebook. My pencil had softened from moisture, and the numbers smeared under my thumb. The lead man was about 230 meters out. The bend was 300. The left guard kept disappearing behind a fallen tree at 260. I marked each point, not because I wanted to shoot, but because a sniper must prepare before the moment arrives. Waiting without preparation is just fear. For almost an hour, we did nothing. The jungle seemed to press down on us. Wet leaves stuck to my cheek. Mosquitoes crawled around my eyes. My right leg had gone numb, but I dared not move it. A drop of sweat rolled from my temple to my chin and hung there like it had all the time in the world. I remember thinking that war could make a man jealous of a drop of sweat because it was free to fall. The escort stopped near the termite mound I had marked earlier. One of the armed men looked uphill toward us. Not directly, but close enough that my chest tightened. Hoa's hand touched my boot. "Stay still." Then the smallest boy stumbled. One sack slid from his shoulder and hit the ground. The guard nearest him turned fast and raised his rifle. Not at us, but at the boy. The child froze. Both hands lifted, his mouth open without sound. Through the scope, I saw Luke turn his head toward me. He was young, but he understood the choice before I did. If I fired, I could save the boy for that 1 second. But I would reveal our position and endanger Wa, Luke, and the scouting team below. If I did not fire, I would have to carry that silence for the rest of my life. Wa whispered, barely moving his lips, "Not yet." The guard struck the boy with the rifle butt instead of shooting him. The boy fell, then stood again, shaking. The column moved on. I kept my eye in the scope, but something inside me had already shifted. We had come to cut off the enemy's source of life. Now I knew that lifeline was being carried by people who had almost no life left of their own. Then Luke whispered from the radio, "Scout team says one guard broke off. He's moving uphill." Wa raised his binoculars again. A moment later, I saw him too. One man had left the trail and was walking straight toward the patch of jungle where we were hidden. The man coming uphill moved like someone who had done it before. He did not walk straight through the brush. He paused, listened, then stepped around dry leaves when he could. His rifle hung low in his hands, but his eyes kept sweeping the slope. That was when I understood our first mistake. We had believed the trail below us was the main route. We had watched it for 3 days, measured every bend, every termite mound, every fallen trunk, but the escort did not act like men protecting a single road. They acted like men testing the ground around it. The trail was bait, or maybe only one branch of something larger. Wa saw it too. He tapped 2 fingers against his notebook, then drew a short line in the wet dirt with a twig. Another line crossed it farther uphill. A second route, hidden deeper in the trees. The man was still coming. Luke's breathing grew louder behind me. He tried to control it, but I could hear the fear caught in his throat. I did not blame him. Fear is not the enemy of a soldier. Panic is. Fear keeps your eyes open. I slowly lowered my cheek to the rifle stock again. The man was less than 100 meters away now. At that distance, I could see the sweat on his neck and the dark mud on his knees. One clean shot would stop him. It would also tell every armed guard below exactly where we were. Hoa's hand closed around my ankle. Wait. It was the hardest order a sniper ever receives, and sometimes the most important. The man climbed another 10 meters. A mosquito crawled across my eyelid. I let it. My left hand cramped around the rifle. A thin stream of sweat slid under my collar. The smell of damp earth and rotting leaves filled my mouth. Somewhere below, a bird burst from the brush, and the whole column froze. The man turned his head. For one long moment, he looked directly at the patch of ferns covering my barrel. I stopped breathing. Then Luke did something small that probably saved us. He reached, slowly as a shadow, picked up a pebble, and flicked it downslope with 2 fingers. It landed far to our left, barely making a sound, but in the jungle, even a small sound can become a direction. The man turned toward it. He raised his rifle and moved away from us, step by step, following the wrong suspicion. Only when he disappeared behind a cluster of bamboo did I let air back into my lungs. Wall leaned close and whispered, "We're in the wrong place." Those words struck harder than gunfire. 3 days of crawling, hiding, measuring distance, and choking down dry rice had brought us to a position that looked perfect but was almost useless. The real supply route was not the open trail below. It ran behind the ridge, where the trees grew thicker and the ground sloped toward a dry streambed. We had judged the enemy too simply. That kind of mistake could get men killed. Through the binoculars, I watched the column move again. The armed guards kept their shape, but the boys carrying bundles were guided off the visible trail and into a narrow break between the trees. The sacks of rice vanished one by one into the green wall. If we had fired earlier, we would have hit only the surface of the thing. The real lifeline would have remained untouched. Luke whispered into the radio, telling the scouting team to hold. The answer came back broken by static. They had already reached the lower bend. Too close, too exposed. I looked at Wah. He did not need to speak. We both knew what had to be done. We would abandon the position we had built with 3 days of patience. No fire, no noise, no pride. We would crawl out under the noses of the men below, circle the ridge, and find the true artery feeding the Pon Pot unit deeper in the forest. Before moving, I looked once more at the trail. The boy who had been struck earlier was limping now, still carrying his load. War has a cruel way of teaching lessons. That day, it taught me that sometimes the target you see first is not the one that matters most. Wah folded his notebook. Luke tightened the strap on his dented canteen. Then the jungle swallowed us again. We moved only after the column had disappeared behind the ridge. Even then, Wah made us wait another 10 minutes. In the jungle, silence after movement can be a trap. Men who think they are safe often stand up too soon. A sniper learns that patience is not bravery. It is survival. When Wah finally gave the signal, we backed out inch by inch. I pulled my rifle close against my chest so the barrel would not catch on vines. Luke moved behind me, one hand on the radio, the other on his leaking canteen. Wah came last, brushing leaves back into place as if we had never been there. That was his habit. He said a good position should look untouched even after men had lived in it for days. The ground behind the ridge dropped into a wet hollow where the mud smelled sour and old. We did not walk. We crawled, slid, and dragged ourselves forward with our elbows. Thorns caught my sleeves. Leeches found the soft skin behind my knees. Several times I had to stop and listen because the forest made every sound seem like a footstep. By dusk, we had covered less than a mile. That may sound slow to people who have never moved through hostile jungle while trying to remain invisible. But each yard had to be earned. A broken twig could be a warning. A bent fern could point toward us. Even the shine from Luke's canteen had to be covered with mud. Our dried rice was almost gone. We each took a small pinch and let it soften in our mouths. There was no fire, no tea, no real rest. My stomach cramped, but hunger was familiar. What worried me was water. My own canteen was half empty. Luke's was worse. Every few minutes, one small drop slipped from the dented seam and darkened the cloth around his waist. Wah noticed it and offered him his canteen. Luke shook his head. "Save it, I'm fine." He was not fine. Near midnight, while we crossed a shallow streambed filled with roots and stones, Luke stumbled and caught himself with both hands. The radio knocked softly against a rock. We froze. Somewhere above us, a night bird cried once, then stopped. I looked back at him. His face was pale under the mud. Sweat ran down his neck even though the air had cooled. His lips trembled, and his eyes had that glassy look I had seen too many times before. Malaria. He tried to smile when he saw me watching. Just tired, he whispered. Nobody believed him. Wah touched Luke's forehead with the back of his fingers. Then he looked at me. No words were needed. We had a choice to make. If we stopped, we might lose the hidden supply route before morning. If we kept moving, Luke might collapse somewhere we could not carry him out. War often puts a man in front of choices that should belong to no one. I thought of Luke reading his mother's letter in the dark, his dream of building her a brick house. I thought of the scouting team waiting below, exposed because of our wrong judgment. I thought of the boys carrying rice under rifles. Everything seemed tied together by that same invisible trail we had been ordered to cut. Wah finally pointed to a cluster of roots under a fallen tree. We crawled into the hollow and spread the hammock tarp over us. Not for comfort but to hide our shapes. The smell of wet canvas and earth closed around my face. Luke shivered between us. For 2 hours, we stayed there while the jungle breathed outside. I listened to insects, dripping water, and Luke's teeth clicking softly in the dark. I wanted to tell him he would be all right. But lies are heavy in war, and men can feel their weight. Before dawn, Wah shook my shoulder. He pointed through a narrow gap in the roots. Far ahead, beyond the streambed, a faint yellow glow moved between the trees. Not sunlight, not fireflies. A covered lantern. Then another. The real supply line was moving again. The lanterns moved without hurry, low and careful, as if the men carrying them knew exactly where every root and stone lay. We watched from beneath the fallen tree, our bodies pressed into mud that had gone cold before dawn. Luke was still shivering beside me. Wah held the binoculars with one hand and used the other to shade the glass so it would not catch the faint light. There were more of them than we expected. At first I counted 5 shadows, then 8, then 12. Some carried sacks on their backs. Others moved empty-handed but kept rifles ready. They were not using the lower trail anymore. They followed the dry streambed. The hidden route Wah had guessed from the ground. It curved behind the ridge, away from our old position, and led deeper into the forest. I opened my range notebook and wrote by touch more than sight. The pencil scratched softly across damp paper. Streambed, 160 meters. Split tree, 210. Bamboo stand, 275. I marked where the lanterns disappeared, then waited for them to reappear. A sniper's work is not only the rifle. It is memory. It is patience. It is knowing how to turn a moving forest into lines, numbers, and decisions. When the last lantern vanished, we followed. We moved after sunrise, but the jungle canopy kept the ground dim. Luke insisted he could continue. His face told another story. His fever came in waves. One moment he crawled steadily behind me. The next his hands shook so badly that Wah had to take the radio from him. No one said the word malaria again. Naming it would not make it kinder. By mid-morning, we found the first sign of the hidden supply point. Rice grains scattered in the mud near a bend in the streambed. Not many, just enough to tell us sacks had been loaded or shifted there. Farther ahead, Wah found a heel print beside a patch of crushed moss. Then a strip of cloth tied around a branch, almost hidden, marking the way for men who already knew the route. We climbed a low rise and crawled into a patch of thorny brush. From there, through a narrow slit between leaves, I saw the place. It was not a large camp. That surprised me. I had imagined a bunker line or a guarded warehouse. Instead, the Pon Pot supply point was made of small things hidden well. 3 roofed pits dug into the earth, a cooking shelter covered with leaves, stacks of rice wrapped in palm matting, and ammunition boxes half buried under wet canvas. Smoke from a tiny fire was guided through a trench so it spread low instead of rising straight into the trees. Whoever built it understood concealment. Wah studied the place for a long time. He pointed out 2 guards near the pits, one by the cooking shelter, and another sitting under a tree with an AK across his lap. I wrote the distances down. Pit 1, 190 meters. Cooking shelter, 235. Tree guard, 260. Trail mouth, 310. Then we saw something that made Wah lower the binoculars. The 2 boys from the column were there. One sat beside a sack of rice, rubbing his shoulder where the rifle butt had struck him. The other was drinking from a bamboo tube while a guard watched him. They were not free to leave. They were part of the supply line, but not by choice. That changed the weight of the mission again. Cutting off the enemy's lifeline sounded simple when spoken over a map. Here, looking down through wet leaves, it meant striking a place where hungry boys, sick carriers, armed guards, rice sacks, and ammunition were all mixed together. One careless shot, one wrong order, and the jungle would swallow the innocent with the guilty. Luke coughed softly behind me. It was not loud, but one of the guards turned his head. We froze. The guard stood, listening. At the same moment, from the far side of the supply point, another patrol stepped into view with a dog on a rope. Hoa's hand tightened around my sleeve. The dog lifted its nose toward our hill. The dog did not bark at first. That was what scared me most. A barking dog gives you a little time. Men look at the dog, then at each other, then toward the noise. But a quiet dog that has caught a scent is worse. It moves with purpose. It pulls men behind it. From our patch of thorny brush, I watched its nose lift and turn toward the hill. The handler tugged the rope once, but the dog leaned harder in our direction. One of the guards near the rice pits stood up. Another reached for the AK lying across his knees. Wah pressed his mouth close to my ear. If it comes higher, they'll find us. I already knew. Luke lay behind us, shaking with fever. He had bitten down on a strip of cloth to keep from coughing. His eyes were open, wide and wet, fixed on the dog as if he could stop it by staring. The radio was under Hoa's chest now, but we could not send a message. Even a whisper into the set might be enough. The dog took 3 steps uphill. I slid my rifle forward a few inches. The barrel moved through leaves I had arranged by hand only minutes earlier. My cheek touched the stock. Through the scope, the world narrowed until there was only the dog, the rope, and the guard behind it. I hated that moment. People who have never been in such a place may not understand. In war, a man can prepare himself to face another armed man. But there are moments when the thing in your sights is not your enemy in the way you want an enemy to be. That dog knew nothing about flags, orders, or pawn pot supply lines. It was only following scent because men had trained it to do so. But if I waited, Wah would die, Luke would die, the scouting team below might walk into a trap without our warning. The entire mission to cut off the enemy's lifeline would end in that patch of brush. I breathed out halfway and held the rest. The shot cracked through the trees. The dog dropped before it could bark. For one heartbeat, the whole supply point froze. Then the jungle exploded with movement. Men shouted. A rifle fired blind into the hillside. Another shot snapped through leaves over my head. Wah grabbed Luke by the shoulder and hissed, "Move." We had prepared our escape route. But preparation is never the same as doing it under fire. I pulled back from the firing slit and rolled into the shallow depression behind us. Mud filled my collar. Thorns tore the skin across my wrist. Luke tried to crawl, but his fever had stolen the strength from his arms. Wah hooked one hand into Luke's harness and dragged him backward. I fired once more, not at a man, but at the trunk beside the nearest guard. The wood splintered near his face, and he dropped behind the rice sacks. That was all I needed. Not a kill, just a second. In a sniper's work, 1 second can be more valuable than a dozen bullets. We changed position fast, low, and uneven. 10 meters back, then 20, then down along the side of the ridge where the brush grew thick enough to hide our movement. Bullets struck leaves above us. The sound was sharp and dry, like someone snapping sticks beside my ear. Wah was behind me, pulling Luke. I heard him grunt once, a short sound he tried to swallow. When we reached the dry streambed, I looked back. Hoa's left eye was squeezed shut. Blood ran from his brow down his cheek, dark against the mud on his face. A splinter of wood, kicked loose by one of their blind shots, had cut him just above the eye. He wiped it with his sleeve and tried to raise the binoculars again. "I can still see," he said. But his voice told me he was not sure. We crawled into a hollow under tangled roots and lay there while the enemy searched the hill we had just abandoned. My hands were still shaking from the shot, not because I had missed, because I had not. Luke breathed hard beside me. Wah held the binoculars with one eye and kept watching the supply point through a gap in the roots. That was the silence after the gunfire, the kind that does not calm a man. It only gives him time to understand what the war has taken from him next. For the next half hour, we existed inside a hole in the earth. Above us, boots moved through brush. Men called to one another in short, sharp voices. They fired now and then at shadows, at leaves, at anything that looked disturbed. Each shot sent small crumbs of dirt falling onto my neck. I kept one hand over the rifle and the other pressed against the mud, as if I could hold the whole hill still by force. Wah lay beside me with his left eye swollen nearly shut. Blood had dried in a crooked line down his cheek. He wiped it once, then stopped wasting movement. With his good eye, he kept watching through a gap between the roots. Luke was worse. His fever had climbed fast after the shooting. His body shook in hard waves, but he fought every sound back into his throat. I could see the effort in his face. He looked younger than 20 then, more like a boy pretending to be a man because the war had not given him another choice. Wah whispered, "We should pull him out." I did not answer right away. The radio crackled softly under Hoa's chest. The scouting team was still waiting for our report. The main force could not move against the supply point unless we confirmed its exact layout and guard positions. If we left, the Pon Pot route might shift again by nightfall. The rice, ammunition, and medicine would disappear deeper into the jungle. The hidden unit we had come to weaken would keep breathing. But if we stayed, Luke might not. I looked at him. His hands were curled against his chest. The dented canteen lay beside him, empty now. A drop of water still clung to the broken seam, trembling but not falling. There are moments in war when duty and friendship stand on opposite sides of you, and both call your name. Wah seemed to read my thoughts. "I can still observe," he said. "You can barely see. One eye is enough for distances." He whispered, "You shoot with one eye, don't you?" It was a bad joke, but it sounded so much like Wah that I almost smiled. I crawled closer to the opening and looked down at the supply point. The guards had spread out after the shot. 2 searched the lower slope. 1 stayed by the rice pits. Another stood near the boys, shouting at them to move sacks away from the exposed side. The whole place was changing in front of us. If I did not record it now, our map would be useless. I opened my notebook again. My fingers were muddy, and the pencil kept slipping. Still, I wrote what I could. Guard near pit, 190. Ammunition under canvas, 215. Escape trail behind cooking shelter, 300. Second trail, east side, partly hidden. I passed the notebook to Wah. He checked the angles, corrected 1 number, and pressed it back into my hand. Luke suddenly gripped my sleeve. "Don't leave because of me," he whispered. His voice was thin, almost gone. I wanted to tell him to shut up. I wanted to tell him he was just a kid and did not get to decide such things. But he was a soldier, and he knew exactly what he was asking. I looked back down the hill. The boys were being pushed toward the cupboard pits. The guards were preparing to move the supplies. If they cleared the camp before our unit came, everything we had endured would mean nothing. Then the radio whispered with static. The scouting team asked for final confirmation. Wall looked at me. Luke closed his eyes and nodded once, as if giving permission he had no right to give. I made my choice. We stay, I whispered, but only until we guide them in. Then we carry Luke out, no matter what. Wah gave the smallest nod. I pressed the radio close and sent the coordinates in a voice barely louder than breath. Below us, the jungle seemed to hold still. Then, far away, I heard the first dull thump of our own guns opening. The main force was moving, and we were still trapped above the supply point. The first rounds from our side did not hit the supply point directly. They landed beyond it, deeper in the trees, blocking the rear escape trail Wah had marked in my notebook. A dull thump rolled through the jungle, followed by the crack and tear of branches coming down. The guards below looked toward the sound, and for a few seconds their attention turned away from our ridge. That was our opening. I shifted to a new firing slit between the roots. My left arm was numb, and mud had dried hard across my sleeve, but the rifle still settled into my shoulder like something I had known all my life. Through the scope, I saw our infantry moving low along the streambed. They were still far away, shapes between leaves, but they were coming. My job was not to win the fight from that hill. It was to keep the way open. The guard near the rice pits raised his rifle toward the streambed. I fired into the dirt beside his feet. The round kicked up mud and splinters, and he threw himself backward behind the sacks. Another guard tried to drag an ammunition box toward the eastern trail. I put a round through the carrying pole. The box dropped, and 2 men scattered. I was not counting targets. I was counting seconds. Every second the guards ducked was a second our men could move. Every second the supplies stayed in place was a second the Pon Pot unit deeper in the forest lost its lifeline. Wah watched with one good eye, his voice low and steady despite the blood on his face. Left side, cooking shelter, one moving. I adjusted. Don't shoot the boys, he added. I see them. The 2 boys were crouched beside a pit, hands over their heads. One of them looked frozen, as if his body had forgotten how to run. Around them, men shouted, sacks were dropped, rifles swung from one direction to another. War had turned that hidden camp into confusion. And confusion is when innocent people disappear under decisions made too fast. Luke groaned behind us. For a moment, I almost turned. Wah heard it too. His voice tightened. Keep watching. Below, one guard grabbed the smaller boy by the arm and pulled him toward the ammunition canvas. Maybe to use him as cover. Maybe just to force him to carry again. I felt my jaw lock. My scope followed the guard, but the boy's body crossed in front of him. I had no shot. I waited. The guard dragged the boy past the cooking shelter. For half a second, his shoulder cleared the child's head. I fired at the wooden post beside him. The post snapped, the leaf roof collapsed, and the guard let go. The boy fell flat and crawled away. Wah whispered, "Good." It did not feel good. It felt necessary, and necessary is a colder thing. Then the main force reached the edge of the supply point. The fight became loud and close. Our men shouted for the carriers to stay down. The guards tried to pull back, but the rear trail was already blocked. One by one, the rice pits were overrun. Ammunition boxes were seized. The cupboard lanterns, the hidden smoke trench, the sacks wrapped in palm matting. All the careful work that had kept that route alive fell apart in minutes. That was when I knew the mission had succeeded. We had cut off the source of life. But victory did not give us time to breathe. Luke's hand slipped from my sleeve. His body sagged sideways in the mud. I turned and saw his eyes half open, unfocused. Wah reached for him, but when he moved, pain crossed his face and his injured eye began bleeding again. Below us, one last burst of gunfire cracked from the eastern brush. A guard who had escaped the first sweep was aiming toward our infantry's flank. I had a clear shot. Behind me, Luke was collapsing. For the first time in many hours, I pulled my eye away from the scope. The war demanded one more second from me. My friend did not have one to spare. I did not take the shot. That is the truth I have carried longer than any medal, any scar, or any old photograph. The guard in the eastern brush had a clear line on our infantry. And I had a clear line on him. Years earlier, I might have believed the choice was simple. A sniper protects the men below. A sniper finishes the mission. But by then, Luke was slipping away behind me, and Wah could barely see through the blood in his one good eye. I turned from the scope and grabbed Luke under the arms. Wah looked at me once. He understood. Without a word, he dragged himself into the firing slit and took over observation. He could not shoot with my rifle from that angle, not with his eye half closed, but he could still warn the men below. East brush, he shouted into the radio, his voice suddenly loud enough to tear his throat. Enemy on your right. The warning went out just in time. Our infantry dropped into the mud as the first burst cracked from the trees. A moment later, one of our machine gunners answered from the streambed. Leaves and bark flew from the eastern brush. The guard disappeared from my sight, and the flank held. I pulled Luke backward through the roots. He was heavier than he looked. Fever had made his body loose, almost boneless, and every yard felt like dragging a sack of wet sand. His dented canteen bounced against my knee, empty and useless. I remember being angry at that canteen, as if a piece of metal had failed him. Wah crawled after us, still clutching the radio and my range notebook. Blood dripped from his eyebrow onto the cover. He kept saying, "Move slow, don't break branches," even while pain bent his voice. Behind us, the supply point fell. There was no cheering that I remember, only shouting, short bursts of gunfire, and the dull sounds of men kicking open covered pits. The rice sacks were captured. The ammunition boxes were counted. The hidden trail was marked for destruction. The Pon Pot unit deeper in the forest would no longer receive what had kept it alive. That was the report they gave later. At the time, all I knew was that Luke was burning in my arms. We reached a shallow ditch beyond the ridge where two medics from our unit found us. One of them was a broad-shouldered man with a torn sleeve and calm hands. He checked Luke's pulse, then slapped my arm and told me to let go. I did not realize I was still holding him. They gave Luke medicine, wrapped him in a poncho, and started carrying him toward the rear. His eyes opened once as they lifted him. He looked at me, then at Wah, and tried to speak. No sound came out. Wah leaned close anyway. "I know," Wah whispered. "We'll tell your mother you fought well." Luke blinked once. That was all. Wah was treated next. The medic washed the blood from his face and pulled a long wooden splinter from the cut above his eye. Wah did not make a sound, but his hand gripped my sleeve so hard his knuckles turned white. Later, the doctor told him his left eye might never see clearly again. Wah only asked whether his notebook had been saved. I showed it to him. He nodded as if that mattered more than the eye. That evening, after the firing had faded and the jungle settled back into its ordinary darkness, the three of us sat under a torn hammock tarp. Luke was wrapped in a poncho beside us, still breathing, still fighting the fever. Hoa's face was bandaged. I had one packet of dried rice left. I split it into 3 small portions, though Luke could not eat his. No one spoke for a long time. The mission had succeeded. We had cut the lifeline. But victory sat among us like another wounded man, silent and difficult to look at. Before we moved out, Hua placed the range notebook in my hand. "Keep it," he said. "Your numbers saved us." I looked at the muddy pages, at the smeared distances and the blood on the cover. "No," I told him. "We saved each other." Hua did not answer. He only leaned back against the tree and closed his good eye. More than 40 years have passed, but that notebook is still with me. It sits in the bottom drawer of my desk, wrapped in a piece of old green cloth. My wife once asked why I kept a dirty little book that smelled of mold and old paper. I did not know how to answer her then. How could I explain that those smeared numbers were not just distances? They were days of hunger, wet leaves against my face, Luke's fevered breathing, and Hoa's hand gripping my sleeve while blood ran into his eye. On the first page, there are still notes from that mission. Termite mound, 180 meters, fallen palm, 240, streambed, 160, rice pit, 190. The pencil marks have faded, but I know them by heart. Sometimes I run my finger across the page and remember the jungle as clearly as if I were still lying there, afraid to move while ants crawled over my hands. Luke survived that day. The medics carried him out before nightfall. For weeks afterward, he drifted in and out of fever. When he finally returned to our unit, he was thinner, quieter, and no longer joked about his dented canteen. He still kept his mother's letter in his shirt pocket. Years later, I heard that he did build her a brick house. It was small, with a tin roof and 2 front windows. To me, that was a better victory than anything written in an official report. Hoa's left eye never fully recovered. He could see shapes and light, but not enough to work as a spotter again. He took it without complaint, the way he took most things. After the war, he did become a teacher, just as he had dreamed. When I visited him once, I saw him standing in front of a classroom with chalk dust on his sleeve. He had one good eye, a calm voice, and a patience that no war had managed to take from him. As for me, I came home with my rifle turned in, my uniform folded away, and too many sounds still living inside my head. For years, a dog barking at night could wake me. The smell of damp earth after rain could put me back under those roots. I would see the hidden rice pits, the boys crouching with their hands over their heads, and Luke slipping sideways in the mud while I chose him over the shot. I have asked myself many times whether I did the right thing. A soldier wants clear answers. War rarely gives them. We cut off the supply route. We helped save our men below. We weakened a Pon Pot unit that had lived off that jungle trail. But none of it felt clean. Not then, not now. That is what I wish younger men understood. War is not made only of attacks, victories, and maps with arrows drawn across them. It is also made of small choices that stay with you: when to shoot, when to wait, when to crawl away, and when to turn from the scope because a friend behind you is still breathing. I still have Luke's dented canteen too. He gave it to me many years later when we met at Hoa's school. He laughed and said it had leaked through half a war and still refused to die. I keep it beside the notebook. The metal is scratched, the seam still broken. When I hold it, I do not think first of the enemy supply line or the mission called, "Cut Off the Lifeline." I think of 3 young men lying in wet Cambodian earth, trying to stay human in a place built to make men forget how. And I think that if anything truly survived that war, it was not glory. It was friendship.